and the U.S. Geologic Survey to use a GPS to find and to document and to pin as many of the graves as possible in Colorado. Our involvement began when Dwayne was the president of the Colorado chapter of Palatine's to America, which is a nationwide group of people researching their German-speaking ancestors, trying to find out their history and their genealogy. And in that capacity, he happened to be attending a meeting of the Colorado Council of Genealogical Societies in 1999. And at that meeting, the lady that was in charge of this Colorado Grave Search Project was looking for volunteers for some of the counties that didn't have volunteers. Well, we were in Boulder County, but someone had already volunteered for Boulder. So we volunteered for Larimer County, and we learned probably more about your county than 80% of you know. When we started our search for these cemeteries in Larimer County, the Colorado Council of Genealogical Societies gave us the pages from a book that they'd published in 1985 that listed 60 graves and cemeteries in Larimer County. So that's what we started with, and the graves here were not on that list. We began the project looking for graves mostly on weekends because I was working full-time still, but Dwayne made trips on weekdays to go without me. But once I retired in December 1999, we could just go anytime we wanted to. To date, we've found about 160 graves or cemeteries in Larimer County, with a cemetery defined by our definition is more than one grave in pretty much the same location. And this is 100 more graves and cemeteries in Larimer County that were on that list that we got in 1985. We became so interested in the history of these graves and cemeteries and in the people that were buried there and in their ancestors and in their descendants and in the history of the property that we decided to write a book on that subject, which we're getting close to the end of now, but we still have to index it. You can't create a history book without a very good index or it's kind of useless. So we're working on it. We plan to publish the book in 2 to 3 volumes. We don't plan to make a profit on the book, but when we sell it, we have to at least not lose money. So at the end of the presentation
We've just had a communication from the Larimer County Sheriff. He is telling us that the Robbers Roost rookies have been sighted again this afternoon. They didn't catch them this morning when they were moving up the stagecoach station. So be aware for these 2 young men. They're armed and really dangerous, and we don't give them money. Thank you.
You guys have been too
Got a credit card?
I thought we were going to have a fire. I'm going to get there, honey. So what I'd like to do next is tell you about the historical evidence that we found that there were graves associated with the stage station even before we found the graves. The first mention we encountered about graves at the stage station was over Memorial Day weekend in 2000 when we were up at the old Glendive Dude Ranch in the Laramie River Valley. We were up there twice that year to find the graves and the cemeteries in that valley, the Laramie River Valley, and near it. And that Dude Ranch has a library. And we started looking in the library and we found a book called The Bridger Pass, Overland Trail, 1862 to 1869 through Colorado, blah, blah, blah. It's a very long title. And that book on pages 34 and 35 talked about the Virginia Dale Stage Station.
Thank you, Carol. I like that floppy chain.
On page 35 of the book, it says the following. On the morning of June 29, 1865, Indians raided Virginia Dale and ambushed the station hunter, Jim Enos. Jim Enos managed to crawl back to the station with an arrow through his chest, where he died in a short while. He was buried in the Little Station Cemetery, end quote. That was the first we knew there was anything here like that. We later got a copy of Dale Tales, the book that Gladys Ellerman wrote about the history of the Virginia Dale area, a book that's been extremely helpful to us researching the graves and the people from your vicinity around here. And she also found this book, and she quotes it on page 5 of her book. But we didn't see her book until after we found the one in the library up in the Laramie River Valley. And it's necessary for anyone who does any history research on Larimer County. We consulted Ansel Watrous' 1911, The History of Larimer County. On page 190 of that book, Watrous says that there are 3 graves associated with the Virginia Dale stage station, and reports that those graves are located, quote, to the southwest of the station on the opposite side of the road. They're up there behind the granite outcrop right over there, or behind it, on that side of it.
Wow. Are they marked?
Yeah, I'll get into that.
Oh, okay.
If we had slides facility, I'd show you slides. Watrous then goes on to say that one of the graves contains the burial of a, quote, white man who was killed by Indians, end quote, while out hunting. However, Watrous does not provide the white man's name, but it surely was Jim Enos. Watrous then goes on to report that that unfortunate fellow was shot in the back by an arrow while he was skinning a deer that he had shot, and then he managed to get himself back to the stage station, where he died and was subsequently buried in the station's, quote, little graveyard, end quote. After talking about the white hunter's death, Watrous goes on to say that the occupant of one of the other graves in the stage station was, and I quote, Mrs. S.C. Leach, whose husband bought the property from the Overland Stage Company and lived in the house and kept the post office there for many years. Mr. Leach went to Wyoming in the early 80s, meaning, of course, the early 1880s, and died there a few years later. Who the occupant of the 3rd grave was is unknown, and that's in quote. Mrs. S.C. Leach was Cynthia B. Leach, where the B stood for her maiden name of Bullock. The S in Mr. Leach's initials stood for Seymour. And I'll provide you a little more information about them shortly. The website on the Overland Trail reports that Mrs. Leach is buried in one of the graves near the stage station and has the following to say about Jim Enos's death and burial. And listen carefully, you'll notice some differences from the earlier reports. On the morning of June 29, 1865, while out to the north and west of Virginia Dale with the division agent Robert Spotswood and Albert Houston, Enos's hunting partner, the caravan of coaches, mail, and passengers came under attack. The fight
Coming up in the main speaker's tent in about 4 minutes will be Eva Sue Littleton as Lady Moon. If you've never heard her do Lady Moon, you really need to be there. And be prepared to laugh.
The fight lasted all day, and it was evening before the Indians drew back. The fight was a bitter one. 2 men lay stretched out, Alex Hardy dead, and Jim Enos with an Arapaho arrow protruding from his abdomen, not his back, his abdomen. He was carried to the Cooper Creek station, of which I have never heard, as an aside, and accompanying the caravan was a surgeon who, unable to pull the arrow out by hand, found it necessary to use a pair of blacksmith tongs. The instant the arrow was removed, Enos died. Not surprisingly. The party carried his body back to Virginia Dale for burial, end quote. Thus we have 2 quotes that give us June 29, 1865 as the death date for Jim Enos. When one visits the stage station cemetery up behind the granite outcropping, on the west of the entrance to the stage station, 4 graves are obvious. In addition, at least one former resident of the area, Raymond Boyd, told us in March 2003 that he had been told that there were 5 graves associated with the stage station cemetery, but we can't find a 5th one. Raymond grew up at his family's ranch about 1.5 miles north of here on what's now the property of the Abbey of St. Walburga. So if Mrs. Cynthia Leach is buried in one of those 4 graves, and if Jim Enos is buried in another, who are buried in the other 2 or 3 graves? Well, the story of Alex Hardy being killed at the same time as Jim Enos makes you wonder if they didn't bring him here too. And in fact, one of the old graves up there is large enough that it could contain 2 bodies. And then the descendants of Seymour and Cynthia Leach told us that their family's history reports that one of Seymour and Cynthia's children died young and is buried up there beside its mother. The genealogy of Seymour and Cynthia Leach's family tells us that Cynthia was born as Cynthia Bullock about 1840 in New York State. She and Seymour Leach married in 1858 in Whiteside County in northwestern Illinois, and they lived in Gold Hill in Boulder County and in Golden and Jefferson County before they moved to Virginia Dale. We don't know the exact date that Cynthia died, but we do know that following her death, her husband remarried on December 23, 1877. The lady he married was Sarah E. Bullock Cushing. Recall that Cynthia's maiden name was also Cushing. The descendants of these two ladies are pretty sure that the two ladies were either sisters or cousins, but they can't tell, they don't know for sure. These Leach relatives are all descendants of a young lady named, well, when she died she wasn't young, a lady named Letty Mae Leach, the only child of Seymour and Cynthia to survive childhood. Letty was born on August 7, 1865, while her parents were living in Golden. She later married a man named William Edward Mister in about 1888, and she was about 17, which seems young to us, but back then that was not at all uncommon. So what do the graves at the Virginia Dale Stage Station look like? In answer to a question that someone asked. First of all, there are no apparent inscriptions on any of the graves. The two westmost graves are side by side. On the right side are the, I think of it as west. You said that's north, right?
South.
That's south. South. Oh, that's okay. The middle of the outcropping. They are oriented.
They're on the southeast.
Southeast side. The tops of these graves, or what we assume are the tops, are marked by nearly vertical pieces of granite, which would have been hard to find around here. The two westmost of these two graves is partially covered by a largest piece of granite that's still standing upright. The other grave, that piece is down flat on the grave, but we feel like it was probably originally standing upright. Somehow it fell. Since a child appears to be buried in the eastmost of these two graves, we're assuming that these two graves are probably the burial place of Cynthia and her child that died young. The other two graves are marked by ovals of smallish local rocks. It is the eastmost of these two graves that is possibly that contains the burial of the two individuals that I was talking about, but we have no way of knowing that. So since Jim Enos and Alex were killed at the same time, and if there are two people in that grave, it could have been them.